The call came in at 4:47 in the morning, and it wasn't from a confidential informant or a wiretapped phone line. It came from a pediatrician in Rochester, Minnesota, named Dr. Amina Osei. She'd been awake for 31 hours when she picked up the phone and dialed the FBI's Minneapolis field office. She didn't ask to speak to a specific agent. She didn't have a case number. She simply said she'd been staring at a spreadsheet for 3 days, and she believed she had found proof that someone was stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government, and that children were being used as the currency. That phone call would eventually trigger one of the most massive coordinated law enforcement operations in Midwestern history. Over 400 arrests, more than $1 billion in alleged fraud, and a network so sprawling and so deeply embedded in the social fabric of Minnesota's immigrant communities that unraveling it would require the combined force of the FBI, ICE, the Department of Homeland Security, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the United States Postal Inspection Service. But before any of that could happen, someone had to believe Dr. Osei, and for weeks, almost nobody did. The spreadsheet she'd compiled was crude, pulled together from public records, personal observations, and the intake forms of children she'd treated at a free clinic in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood of Minneapolis, a dense urban corridor sometimes called Little Mogadishu for its large Somali American population. Dr. Osei had noticed something peculiar over the course of 18 months. When children were showing up at her clinic enrolled in federally funded nutrition programs designed to feed kids from low-income families during after-school hours and summer breaks. But the children she examined weren't malnourished. Many came from stable households. Some told her, in the guileless way children do, that they'd never actually eaten at the sites listed on their enrollment forms. A few mentioned being driven to buildings they'd never entered, just long enough for someone to check their names off a list, and then driven home. Dr. Osei started mapping. She cross-referenced the names of feeding sites registered with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's federal child nutrition programs against physical addresses she could verify. What she found was staggering. Dozens of sites listed as active meal distribution centers were, in reality, vacant lots, shuttered storefronts, or private residences. One address corresponded to a parking garage. Another was a hair braiding salon that closed at 3 p.m. every day, yet claimed to serve dinner to 200 children nightly. When Special Agent Carolyn Voss of the FBI's Minneapolis field office finally reviewed Dr. Osei's findings in late February, she didn't sleep for 2 days. Not because the evidence was so damning on its face. It was circumstantial, messy, the work of an exhausted doctor and not an investigator, but because Voss had spent 11 years in white-collar crime, and she recognized the architecture. This wasn't petty fraud. This was engineered, layered, and it was operating at a scale that suggested an organization far more sophisticated than a handful of opportunists filing false claims. Voss assembled a small team and began pulling threads. Within weeks, the picture that emerged was breathtaking in its audacity. A network of nonprofit organizations, shell companies, and food distribution entities had been systematically exploiting the USDA's child nutrition reimbursement programs. The mechanics were elegant in their simplicity. The federal government reimburses organizations that provide free meals to children in need. File the paperwork showing you fed a certain number of kids, and the money flows. The more children you claim to serve, the more you receive. There are checks and balances in the system, of course. Site inspections, enrollment verifications, financial audits. But the network had anticipated all of them. At the center of the web sat a man named Idris Warsome. On paper, Warsome was a modest community leader, founder of a nonprofit called the Horizon Youth Alliance, a board member of 3 charitable organizations, and a frequent guest at local political fundraisers. He drove a 10-year-old Toyota Camry. He lived in a nondescript apartment in the Whittier neighborhood. He attended Friday prayers regularly and was known for his generous donations to community causes. By every visible measure, he was exactly what Minnesota's civic leaders loved to celebrate: a successful immigrant giving back. But behind the carefully maintained facade, Warsome was running what federal prosecutors would eventually describe as one of the largest fraud schemes ever perpetrated against a federal nutrition program. The Horizon Youth Alliance was the flagship operation, but it was merely the visible tip. Beneath it sprawled a network of over 60 shell organizations, each one filing claims for meals that were never prepared, served to children who were never present, at locations that often didn't exist. The money, federal reimbursement dollars, flowed into accounts controlled by Warsome and a tight inner circle. From there, it moved through a dizzying labyrinth of transfers. Real estate purchases in Minnesota, Arizona, and Kenya. Luxury vehicles registered to family members in 3 states. Wire transfers to accounts in Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and the United Kingdom. One single month's haul, investigators would later determine, exceeded $12 million. But Warsome hadn't built this alone. The network required foot soldiers, people to register the phantom feeding sites, recruit the children whose names would populate the enrollment lists, handle the bookkeeping, and most critically, manage the inspectors. This is where the operation revealed its most troubling dimension. Several of the state-level inspectors tasked with verifying feeding site operations were themselves connected to the network. Not through bribery in the traditional sense, no envelopes of cash passed under tables, but through community pressure, familial obligation, and in some cases, direct financial participation in the scheme. A state inspector named Farah Noor, who oversaw compliance for a dozen feeding sites in Hennepin County, was simultaneously drawing a salary from 2 of Warsome's shell nonprofits. And another inspector had a brother who managed one of the fictitious sites. The system of oversight had been hollowed out from within. Agent Voss understood that building a federal case of this magnitude would require patience. You don't bring down $1 billion fraud network with a single search warrant. You map every node. You follow every dollar. You turn every person you can turn. The investigation, codenamed Operation Harvest, grew quietly through the spring and summer. The FBI brought in forensic accountants from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. ICE Homeland Security investigations joined to trace the international money flows and investigate potential immigration fraud connected to the scheme. Several individuals involved had used fraudulently obtained nonprofit credentials to sponsor visa applications. DHS provided intelligence analysts who helped the team understand the network's structure, which resembled less a traditional criminal hierarchy than a decentralized franchise operation, with Warsome as the silent architect and dozens of semi-autonomous operators running their own claimed feeding sites under his umbrella. The sheer volume of fraudulent transactions created both a challenge and an opportunity. Every false claim generated a paper trail. Every wire transfer left a digital fingerprint. The investigators built their case the way you build a cathedral, stone by painstaking stone. They obtained records from 47 banks. They subpoenaed financial documents from over 100 entities. They conducted hundreds of interviews, and many of them with parents who had no idea their children's names were being used to siphon millions from a program designed to feed hungry kids. And this is where the story cuts deepest. Because the ultimate victims of Operation Harvest weren't abstract federal budgets or line items in a government spreadsheet. They were the children the programs were supposed to serve. While Warsome's network was claiming to feed tens of thousands of kids across Minnesota, actual feeding programs in the same communities were struggling for funding. Legitimate nonprofits that genuinely served meals to children living in poverty found their reimbursement claims delayed, scrutinized, sometimes denied, because the federal pipeline was being gorged by phantom operations. One legitimate after-school program in North Minneapolis, run by a woman named Grace Abelow, shut down entirely in the summer because the state had flagged her district as oversaturated with nutrition services. The services the state was counting didn't exist. But Grace Abelow's program, which fed real children real food, did. Until it couldn't anymore. By late autumn, Voss and her team had enough to move. But the logistics of the takedown were staggering. Over 400 targets spread across the Twin Cities metro area, with secondary targets in Ohio, Virginia, Arizona, and overseas. The fear of alerting the network, many of whose members were connected through tight-knit community bonds and could warn each other within minutes, meant that the operation had to be synchronized down to the second. This wasn't a cartel raid with flashbangs and breaching charges. And this was a white-collar takedown that required the precision of a military operation. On the morning of the raids, over 1,000 federal agents and local law enforcement officers staged in parking garages, hotel conference rooms, and unmarked offices across Minneapolis and St. Paul. The operation began at 6 a.m. Simultaneously, FBI agents knocked on doors in Burnsville, Brooklyn Park, Richfield, Edina, and Eden Prairie. ICE Homeland Security investigations teams executed arrest warrants at businesses in the Midway district of St. Paul and along Lake Street in Minneapolis. IRS agents seized computers, financial records, and hard drives from offices that had, until that morning, presented themselves as charitable organizations serving the community's most vulnerable. Idris Warsome was arrested at his apartment without incident, but he was dressed for morning prayers. He said nothing to the agents who handcuffed him, offered no resistance, displayed no surprise. Those who arrested him would later remark on his stillness, as though he had been expecting this moment, or had already made his peace with it. In his apartment, agents found 3 cell phones, a laptop with encrypted files, and a leather portfolio containing handwritten notes in Somali that, when translated, detailed projected revenue from feeding sites that had never served a single meal. Across the metro, the arrests unfolded with remarkable efficiency. In the first 72 hours, over 200 individuals were taken into custody. By the end of the first week, the number exceeded 300. By the time the operation's initial phase concluded, more than 400 people had been arrested on charges ranging from wire fraud and money laundering to conspiracy to commit federal program fraud. The indictments described a scheme that had stolen an estimated $1.2 billion from federal child nutrition programs over a period of roughly 4 years. The community response was immediate and fractured. In Cedar Riverside, some residents expressed relief. They'd known something was wrong, had whispered about it among themselves, but felt powerless to challenge community leaders without being labeled traitors. Others were furious, insisting the raids were racially motivated, that federal agents had descended on a vulnerable immigrant community with disproportionate force. Protests materialized outside the federal courthouse. Community advocates held press conferences demanding transparency, and the story became a national flashpoint, tangled in debates about immigration, federal overreach, cultural sensitivity, and the grotesque irony of a system designed to feed hungry children being cannibalized by greed. What often gets lost in the scale of the numbers, 400 arrests, $1 billion stolen, is the granular human wreckage. Consider Halima, a single mother of 4 whose name appeared on enrollment forms for 3 different fictitious feeding sites. She'd been paid $200 a month to let someone use her children's names. She thought it was a community assistance program. She didn't read English well enough to understand the forms she signed. When agents came to interview, she was terrified she'd be deported. Though she'd been a legal resident for 9 years, she isn't a villain in this story. And she's a footnote in someone else's fraud. And there are hundreds like her. Consider the state employees who should have caught this years earlier. Minnesota's Department of Education, which administered the USDA funds at the state level, had received complaints about suspicious feeding sites as early as 2 years before Dr. Osei made her call. Internal emails obtained during the investigation revealed that at least 3 mid-level administrators had flagged irregularities, only to be told that aggressive oversight of programs serving immigrant communities could create political complications. Governor Arden Lindstrom, a fictional name standing in for the political apparatus that enabled the negligence, had built a significant portion of his platform on community partnership with immigrant populations. In cracking down on nonprofits in those communities, even fraudulent ones, carried political risk that nobody in the governor's orbit wanted to absorb. So the warnings were filed, the irregularities were noted, and the money kept flowing. Agent Voss, in a rare public comment during a press briefing following the arrests, addressed this directly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't grandstand. She simply said, "The fraud was massive, but the failure of oversight that allowed it to reach this scale was a choice. People chose not to look." The international dimension of the case added yet another layer of complexity. ICE Homeland Security investigations traced over $400 million in wire transfers to accounts in Nairobi, Istanbul, and Dubai. Some of the funds had been used to purchase real estate, luxury apartments in Nairobi's Westlands district, commercial properties in Istanbul's Beyoğlu neighborhood. Other transfers appeared to fund businesses that themselves may have been fronts for additional financial activity that investigators are still working to untangle. Several of the individuals arrested held dual citizenship or had family connections that spanned multiple continents, raising questions about whether portions of the stolen funds were being funneled into networks that extended far beyond Minnesota's borders. The legal proceedings that followed the arrests have been grueling and protracted. Defense attorneys argued that many of the lower-level defendants were coerced, confused, or culturally isolated from the realities of the system they'd been pulled into. The prosecutors countered that while sympathy is warranted for some, the architects of the scheme knew exactly what they were doing and built it with deliberate sophistication. Warsome himself, through his attorneys, maintained that he was a community organizer who trusted the wrong people. The encrypted files on his laptop told a different story, one of meticulous planning, revenue projections, and contingency strategies for evading detection. As of the time this story is being told, the case remains one of the largest federal fraud prosecutions in American history. It has prompted congressional hearings on the vulnerability of federal nutrition programs to exploitation. It has triggered reforms in how the USDA verifies feeding site operations. And it has left a community reeling, caught between the genuine need for the services that were supposed to exist and the betrayal of those who turned that need into a machine for personal enrichment. There is a moment in every investigation like this, a moment that isn't tactical or forensic or legal, but simply human, that captures what it all means. For Agent Voss, it came during an interview with Grace Abalo, the woman whose legitimate feeding program had been shut down by the phantom surplus. Abalo sat in a conference room at the FBI's field office, not as a suspect, but as a witness, and described the last day her program operated. She'd made jollof rice and fried plantains. 43 children ate that afternoon. She remembered the number because she always counted. When she told the kids it was the last day, some of them cried. Not because they understood bureaucracy or fraud or federal reimbursement pipelines. They cried because they were hungry, and this was where they ate. That is what $1 billion stolen looks like when you strip away the indictments and the wire transfers and the encrypted laptops. It looks like a child crying over a plate of rice. This story is fiction, but the crisis it reflects is not. Federal nutrition programs remain vital lifelines for millions of American children, and the systems designed to protect them require vigilance, accountability, and the courage to investigate even when investigation is politically inconvenient. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who should hear it. And if you have thoughts on how systems like these can be better protected, leave them below. The conversation matters as much as the story.